A loud voice rang out through the dome-shaped room. I assume you're looking for the emerald shrub. The voice paused as if waiting for a response. Who am I kidding? Of course you are. In the middle of the room, a small stand with an even smaller bright green thing rose out of the floor. That's the shrub, said the spiker, seemingly not noticing that it was obvious. He took a step forward before the voice rang out again, much louder this time. You don't seem to understand. My dearest apologies for not explaining this to you earlier. The spiker made a loud grunt, clearly dissatisfied that he couldn't just waltz up to the artifact and take it. I was summoned for the sole purpose of stopping ruffians like yourselves from getting your grubby mitts on this poor little shrub. A much quieter chuckle could be heard before the voice continued with, I'll do my best to make sure your death is exciting as possible. The entrance to the room was instantly blocked by a red wall that seemed to come out of nowhere. On the other side of the room, right next to the emerald shrub, a figure wearing a dark green robe manifested itself. Its face concealed in darkness, it made a small hop, revealing its thin legs wrapped in red cloth. Landing on one foot, the figure shouted from all directions at once. Best of luck to you. The figure's body stabilized as its other foot dropped to the wood floor. Well, not really. I don't actually want you to succeed in the slightest. After a short pause where I could swear the figure's obscured face was winking at us, we began sprinting as fast as we could towards it. My heart raced to my chest as we narrowly avoided getting flattened by a massive red cube that had also appeared out of nowhere. As we got closer to the stand, the voice rang out again. I think we should make this a little harder. A curved red wall rose up from the ground, completely blocking our view of the stand. I have no idea what's going on, yelled Ryan, sweat dripping down his face. There are no records of anything like this. For heaven's sake, this thing appears to be sentient. His breathing slowed very slightly. We should have expected something like this, considering no one has lived to record anything. Ignoring Ryan's ramblings, the spiker let out a loud cough before grabbing the both of us and tossing us over the wall. I'll climb over after you, he shouted to the best of his ability. Ryan let out a squeal as he landed awkwardly on his ankle. Trying to stand up, he produced another squeal before falling over again. It's broken, he said, looking at me desperately from the ground. Running to his aid, I let out a gasp as a small red cube fell through his right calf. Ryan! I screamed, my throat feeling the driest it had ever been in my life. Ryan let out a miserable scream as he realized that a good part of his right leg had been utterly demolished. Miraculously regaining some of his composure, he firmly told me, Go get the shrub and kill the god. A cry of pain left his mouth before he could finish his sentence. In a fit of rage, I turned towards the figure and lifted my dagger towards it. As the blade shot straight at it, it lifted its arm, which raised another red wall that deflected my blade. Very exhilarating, isn't it? The voice rang out teasingly. In any case, let's hurry it up so this gets finished before it gets boring. Before I knew it, two massive hands, one cold and one warm, clenched around me and tossed me over the second wall. Landing generally safely, I bolted towards the figure. A thin red wall fell from above me and barely landed behind me. My mind racing, I felt a slight tinge of happiness as I realized how great of a story this would be. I legitimately wanted Ryan to survive, but I decided it would be best not to focus on him as I fought. Nearly falling onto a group of razor-sharp red spikes that had appeared on the ground, I realized I had managed to get very close to the figure. Its face still shrouded in darkness, it created another large red cube that bolted in my direction. Seeing me barely dodge the cube, just like the last two, the figure said, I'll admit you're fast. The figure snapped its bony fingers. I still can't say I'm a fan, though. The room around me turned dark in an instant. My grip of reality started to dissipate as I heard the Guardian's voice again, this time in my head. Getting that shrub sure means a lot to you, it said. I bet it would make you oh so famous. The grand story of how you defeated me and obtained this precious artifact would be heard all around your pathetic little settlement. The Guardian paused for a moment, in which I tried desperately to escape the darkness. I pushed for my body to move, but it wouldn't budge. As the already pitch-black room seemed to get even darker, the voice returned to my head. There is one problem you might face, it said, sounding almost genuinely concerned for a moment. In order to keep that fame, you'll have to keep doing hunts like these all the time. I tried to scream, but my mouth, which I wasn't even sure was there, didn't make any noise. Pushing with all my might, the room got a little lighter. Hearing a loud thud that sounded much further away than its volume would suggest, I was able to open my eyes. All my senses returned. I looked a few meters away, where the figure stood leaning slightly down towards me. I'll leave you that thought, he whispered. Now, let's finish this up. You've quite overstayed your welcome, my friend. A frown appeared on my face as I tried to understand what was happening. It was the same voice, but it seemed like a different entity altogether. I observed it start to hop from side to side as it chanted something that wasn't being projected. Another small red cube suddenly slammed through my left arm. I felt no pain due to the sheer shock of seeing part of my arm torn to shreds just like Ryan's leg. Blood gushed everywhere, taking bits of my crushed bone along with it. Just as the figure's arms raised, likely to summon some red thing to kill me, it started to say, "Your pathetic little body will shatter under the extreme pressure." The spiker's massive hands clapped around the figure's green hood. Loud cracking could be heard as the figure's obscured head was flattened. The spiker dropped the figure's now limp body and made for the stand behind him. The air around me filled with the now massive black clouds coming from the spiker's mechanical arm and silver smoke escaping the figure's mangled hood. Its bony hands began crumbling into powder that stayed rested on the wooden floor. "Let's go," said the spiker, slightly more enthusiastically than usual. "We're both going to be in good after this one." An actual grin grew on his distorted face before he came to understand my predicament. Tossing a small bottle at me, he calmly said, "Drink some of this crap. It'll clog up the blood flow in your arm." I hurriedly chugged the bottle and almost instantly noticed the flood of red slow down. The spiker seemed to notice as well, so he began to turn and walk away. Catching up with him, the revolting taste of the liquid and an unbelievable excruciating pain in my arm hit me like a zooming meteorite. The adrenaline had gone, leaving me all the pain a somewhat obliterated arm might bring. As beads of bright red blood dripped out of my short brown hair, I fought the urge to collapse. Strings of sharp pain shot through what nerves I had left as we slowly made our way over the red walls that were now shrinking. It wasn't fast enough for the spiker to wait for them to completely disappear, but it was definitely visible. Totally occupied by my arm, I barely noticed the massive red cube lying where Ryan had been. The huge puddle of blood that had flowed from under it went mostly unnoticed by the two of us. Two people dressed in all white sped into the waiting room. One was a tall woman with a grim expression on her face, and the other was a particularly short man lifting a huge box of medical supplies. The two of them stopped right in front of me and the spiker. Swiftly exiting his office, Douglas said, "I need the two of you to be done in 10 minutes. He turned towards the spiker. "Get your new prosthetics. The event will begin very soon." The spiker made a wide grin like a kid that had just been informed of a particularly fun day to come. My gaze returned to the two people dressed in white to see the tall woman now frowning intensely coming towards me with a syringe. Recklessly dropping the box of medical supplies that made a loud thud when it hit the floor, the short man ran up to me and lifted my partially destroyed arm so the woman could see it clearly. The woman said dryly, "This will delay the pain for the next few hours." She quickly raised the syringe over my arm as her voice droned on. "Try not to flinch, or this will become much more complicated." The syringe was plunged into my upper arm as I gasped from the near instant relief. Feeling significantly more awake, I noticed Douglas approaching the man and the woman. He whispered quietly to them before winking at me and swiftly returning to his office. The woman's nearly closed eyes opened wide as she accessed the metal box of medical supplies and dug around in it for a few seconds. Her hands returned, each one clenching a peculiar item. On the left, there was a bag of what appeared to be a kind of tan clay. On the right, she held a second transparent syringe containing a dark crimson liquid. The spiker that was miraculously still in the room turned towards us and noticed the syringe, his eyebrows raised as his gaze turned towards me. His battered face contorted into a sort of glare before he turned around and finally exited the room, haphazardly pulling off and dropping his mechanical arm in the process. Thudding on the ground nearby, the slow stream of black smoke it had been outputting faded into nothing. I felt the second syringe pierce my skin, but I didn't feel any effect of it. Standing up, I was gleefully shoved back down onto the chair by the short man. The woman explained in the same bored voice, "That syringe will allow naturally unhealable wounds to make a full recovery." She opened the bag of the clay-like substance and continued, "It sure won't be instant, however. Until it's healed, you have to appear to be unquestionably healthy." Shoving a chunk of the substance into the somewhat cube-shaped hole in my arm, the woman flattened it to appear as if my arm was completely intact. The man chuckled and said, "Holes like these are a lot easier for us to deal with than whole limbs." "Yes, they are. said the woman, slowly turning towards the door the spiker had left the room through. I scanned my arm to discover that it was nearly indistinguishable from its previous state. If I looked hard enough, I could see the substance, but from a distance, no one could possibly tell. I can't actually remember a single treasure hunter with battle scars, I thought, dipping into the memories of my childhood. I didn't think much of it after I began to comprehend how helpful Douglas and these two unknown people had been. The man knocked on the door to Douglas's office and shouted, "He's ready!" before he and the tall woman swiftly exited the room. The short man nearly fell over multiple times on the way out from holding the heavy box. Douglas's door swung open, revealing that he had a massive smile on his face. "This is it, Felix," he said, hastily rushing towards me. "You've made it to the big league." Helping me up from the chair, Douglas gave me a slip of paper with instructions on where to go. "You'll be begging me to let you get the second piece after this," he said, turning back towards his office. Snapping his fingers, he rhythmically opened the door and passed into the room once again. I took a deep breath and raised the slip of paper to meet my eyes. Before I could read anything, however, Hunter, who had been standing silently in the back of the room, spoke in a low voice. "That red liquid, the one in the second syringe." Hunter's eyes shifted from left to right. "There's a lot of treasure hunters who would kill to have it," he said ominously. "All right," I said, the word almost sounding like a question. Hunter let out a sigh as his eyes shifted to blankly stare at the wall to his right. Ignoring Hunter's odd behavior, my gaze returned to the slip of paper held in my right hand. I was instructed to make my way to the main lobby of the office. I hadn't spent much time there since I was allowed immediate access to this waiting room and sometimes Douglas's office. When I entered the lobby, I instantly noticed a large crowd forming outside the windows. I could see all kinds of people eagerly waiting for something to happen. A loud grunt caused me to turn around and see the spiker standing behind me. My eyes widened as I saw his long red hair, missing patch of his cheek, and his left flesh arm had all returned. The other scars on his face had disappeared as well, making him simultaneously more and less recognizable at the same time. "They really can work wonders," I said to the spiker. "Yes, they can," he said in a much more upbeat voice than I had gotten used to. "Come on, it's time we got our deserved recognition." Right as we exited the building, the crowd rushed forwards towards us. These were the fans. The people of Red Town finally recognized me as a great treasure hunter. The beaming faces of the people closest to us caused me to beam back at them. The next 2 hours went by in a blur that I can barely remember. Me and the spiker interacted and chanted with the fans until our voices started to fade. Many of the young boys that managed to see us were clearly having the time of their lives. That I had in common with them. Through the whole event, there was only one thing that I can remember clearly. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, I saw Jamie's worried face staring back at mine. "Felix, what in the name of?" yelled my father, his beard a few inches lower due to his mouth being gaping wide open. "What happened today?" A few seconds previously, I had entered the cabin where my father was waiting patiently. He vaguely asked if my day had gone well before the clay-like substance in my arm instantly turned to a liquid and drooped onto the floor. My father aggressively reached for my arm to inspect it, almost damaging it further in the process. "How did this happen?" my father asked, his eyes raised to meet mine. "Your mother was right about treasure hunting." I stepped back, though I was unable to free my arm from my father's surprisingly tight grip. "It's not as bad as it looks," I said, trying to defuse the situation. "I got a special injection that will let it heal." My father let go of my arm and pondered for a second. After a long sigh, he calmly said, "I'm happy that you're going to be okay, but I'm still worried. This seems like a bad omen." "That's a pretty bad way of thinking of it," I said. "It's just a learning experience. If I make mistakes now, I won't later." "It appears you're already in the later," said my father, tightly pursing his lips before continuing. "Your mother died trying to stop this madness." "What are you talking about?" I asked, legitimately confused. "She thought that running a treasure hunting company was extremely immoral," said my father, his gaze drifting away from my eyes. "I wonder what she could have accomplished if the world wasn't so cruel." I opened my mouth to object, but only silence left it. I didn't know what to say. "I don't know exactly how she died, no one does, but I do know that she would have been very unhappy knowing you had become a treasure hunter." My father's sad eyes finally met mine as he dropped a single tear. In a sarcastic tone, I said, What did she know? Almost too quiet for my father to hear. His mouth opened wide once again before he shouted, "Your mother worked with everything she had trying to save already useless people like you." Beginning to hyperventilate, he continued, "Tomorrow you will go with me and begin your lumber career. I will hear nothing more of treasure hunting or fame under this roof." He slammed his fist on a wood table to his right, causing a wide crack to be propelled across it. He slowly finished with, "Do you understand?" My eyes fell to the floor as I made a small nod. I began making my way to my room, infuriated with my father. Even our cat Fred seemed to look at me with disdain as I passed him. A war being fought inside my head, I managed to close the door without slamming it. I practically fell into my bed, praying that I could just go to sleep. I'm not going to do it, I told myself. Rolling over in my bed, I thought, how does he even expect me to work in lumber with my arm in its current state? I thought about the day's event and how great it had been. The room seemed to grow darker as I returned to the memory of Douglas's story. I'd be stupid to imagine that the bakery gained its extreme success without having to overcome any hiccups. I need to get out of here. I just have to go somewhere in Red Town, I thought to myself. The pain in my arm slowly returned, causing sleep to seem far from the realm of possibilities. Though there was still no bleeding, the pain grew to hurt more than it did originally. I closed my eyes, did my best to turn off my brain, and desperately hoped for any amount of sleep. I returned to the void of darkness previously induced by the brush's guardian. Though my original experience there only lasted about a minute, the endless black now seemed incredibly unfamiliar without an obnoxious voice ringing through my head. Much less desperate to escape this time, I fell into a serene state where very few thoughts pierced my mind. I saw the smiling faces of the crowd of fans. I saw articles in the news loudly proclaiming I did something important. I saw money all around me. I did not see my father. I did not see Jamie. For only a moment, I caught a glimpse of my mother's blurry face. Unlike everything else, it legitimately caught my attention. I tried to reach out with my non-existent arms, but the memory faded. I continued living in the void for what felt like much more than the night. At times I would think of attempting to escape. These thoughts were quickly extinguished by the vague memories of a burning pain I knew I would have to return to if I escaped my slumber. Eventually, I felt the warm grip of my covers surrounding me. The feeling was faint, but it grew increasingly clear as my thoughts returned to my now half-developed plan of escape. I have to wake up, I thought to myself, trying and failing to move my drowsy body. If I can leave before my father wakes, this will be much easier for both of us. I slowly lifted a single finger. After the first movement, the rest of the waking process was easy. Just dressed, I stealthily progressed towards the front door. I inhaled sharply as footsteps rang out in the room ahead of me. Sliding behind the sofa facing the doorway, I realized I did not have my leather bag, of which I most definitely needed. I made to peek from behind the sofa just as my father's loud footsteps continued pattering towards me. The noise grew increasingly louder, and I knew he had entered the room. I was sure I could just leave if I wanted to, but I didn't want to cause any more conflict. The sofa thudded backwards a bit as my father aggressively dropped himself onto it. My heart pounded rapidly in my chest, but I managed to calm it down somewhat with the knowledge that my father had no reason to look behind the sofa. His left arm dropped to his side, almost as limp as my own. As I observed it closer, I saw it begin to shake. Soon startled by my father suddenly speaking to himself in a firm voice, I had no choice but to listen. "You always said this forest could keep us safe from harm. That the tree's wood was blessed to protect those in danger ages ago." My father took a long sigh before continuing. "I guess you did say a bit more than that. I didn't really believe any of it when I was young, especially not the part about making a sacrifice. So when I realized it was true, I had already forgotten many of the details. I never should have just expected protection to be given to us so easily." He stopped for a moment as he took a deep breath. "Dad, I believe my son has left our protection behind. He has forsaken the sacrifice given to the universe, so if he ever needs to be shielded from harm again, something else will be taken from him." A quiet sob broke the silence. My father's left arm was now petting Fred, who had just jumped up onto the arm of the sofa. My eyes met with Fred's for only a moment. He meowed loudly, causing my father to stand up. In a much higher-pitched voice than usual, my father said, "I'm sure you're very hungry. I'll fetch you some meat pieces to eat." My father's footsteps resumed as he went to leave the room. Just as he left, I heard him mutter, "I'm glad you like them. They're very protein dense." I snagged the leather bag and a bit too loudly escaped the cabin. He even thinks he can speak with his dead father? I kind of feel bad for him, I said aloud. Running down the path to Redtown, the thoughts of my father began being replaced with the memories of the previous day. I was determined to continue being a treasure hunter. Though thoughts of treasure hunting and fame helped my mood, the pain pulsing from my arm did not. I couldn't believe that achieving my dream would be hindered to such an extreme extent by it. Before I entered Redtown, I heard a distant voice shouting my name. Coming from the long grasses to my right, the voice sounded much more graceful than one practically screaming should have. Highly curious, I turned to see the source of the noise. My lips pursed as I saw Jamie running towards me. "Felix, I'm so glad I found you," she said, ignoring my clear disdain at seeing her. "Please, you have to listen to me. You can't keep working for Douglas Maverick. It's just not safe." Tempted to scream, I replied, "I absolutely can." Jamie took a deep and quite audible breath before saying, "I found some really important stuff that you should see." She began digging in a velvet purse hanging at her side. "It'll make you want to stop immediately." With a clear sense of superiority in my voice, I said, "In that case, I definitely don't want to see it." Rolling her eyes, Jamie said, "Ha ha, very funny, but I'm not going to let you get away without at least getting the gist of this." Looking me directly in the eyes, she continued, "I'm really serious about this." Desperate to get her to leave me alone, I sort of gestured that she could tell me. Giving me a thankful smile, she held up a small notebook to her face. Only half listening to Jamie, I caught her mentioning my mother. My previously relaxed neck snapped upright as I stared her down. Scared she had somehow insulted me, Jamie replied, "I was just mentioning that she was never happy to go to her job. At least, that's what one of her friends said." While I wasn't particularly interested in which one of her friends this was, my attention had been caught. "Your mother used to have to keep track of Douglas Maverick's employees for him," said Jamie. "She discovered through her work that running a treasure hunting business is extremely immoral. Most recruits stop signing in after their first or second official hunt. Even some of the most well-known treasure hunters would disappear out of nowhere. Officially, only a few treasure hunters have died on the job. However, your mother believed otherwise." A quiet snort escaped my mouth. Jamie likely hadn't noticed as her reading of the paper continued firmly. "She started collecting evidence that she planned on revealing to the public. She wanted treasure hunting to be discontinued, or at least more monitored." Jamie looked up from the notebook. Biting her lip, she continued, "Of course, you know that didn't quite work out." My attention fading once again, I told Jamie, "Thank you for informing me on the gossip of my mother's previous friends, but it is very important to me that I continue treasure hunting even with the dangers involved." Jamie's head lowered as she stuffed the notebook back in her bag. "Even if you won't take it completely seriously, please just be careful," she said, returning her gaze to me. "I will," I said defiantly. I don't know why you would think that I wouldn't. My posture worsened as Jamie glanced at my limp arm. "That was just a fluke," I thought to myself. "It happened once, so it definitely won't happen again." Jamie began walking towards Redtown, velvet purse hanging at her side. I decided to wait a minute after she had left, just to be sure I wouldn't have to interact with her again. I wish my mother's life could have just finished like any normal one was supposed to, I told myself as I entered Redtown. As I waved at some children that recognized me, I thought, who are they to manipulate her death into some kind of message? Not exactly sure what to do, I decided to just sit in the waiting room and, wait. Before I could sit down, Hunter motioned for my attention. "The boss said you should do some research on the location of your next hunt since you can't actually do the hunt yet," said Hunter. "Okay, yeah, that sounds good," I said quietly. "Hey, you okay, Felix?" asked Hunter, leaning slightly forward. "Yeah, just disappointed that I can't go on a hunt yet," I said, half telling the truth. "If you say so," said Hunter, snapping his fingers in the same manner that Douglas was known for. "The boss is pretty happy about your work so far. Even if it hasn't been perfect, he says you've definitely exceeded his expectations." Not sure whether to be offended or flattered, I just smiled at Hunter before entering the library. Reaching in my bag for the map of Tri-City, my eye was caught by something to my right. The cabinet containing a scarlet box was wide open. seemingly beckoning for me to go to it. The 3 chains formerly attached to separate locks now lay to the side of the box. The top of the box itself was slightly open. Taking a quick glance behind me, I fully opened the box. This isn't any of my business, I thought, not slowing my rummaging in the slightest. The box contained 3 books, all listing the various significant events of each week within the past 20 years. I opened the book at the top of the box to see my own name on the page. Felix Terrell has become a highly valuable treasure hunter now that the public has been alerted to his presence, I read off the page. While he may very well die attempting to complete the Fruitless tree, the reward is definitely worth the risk. Slightly put out, I closed the book and decided that it really wasn't something I should be snooping around in. Right as my eyes glossed over the second book, a dark thought entered my head. Maybe I can find something to prove my mother misunderstood the treasure hunting business, I told myself, opening the second book to about the halfway point. Frequently glancing behind me, I turned the pages to reach a very specific date. My hand shook as a page labeled with the date of my mother's death was displayed in front of me. Up until that point, I couldn't find her name mentioned anywhere. Finally, spotting her name, I began to read. Hopeful that I would find something to disprove Jamie and my father, I paid extra attention to each word. That was the exact moment I found it. Not the proof I was looking for, but the proof Jamie was. Today, I ordered the termination of one Amanda Terrell due to her gaining access to documents that would pose a threat for the company if they were to get out. I read, my heart sinking lower into my stomach with every passing letter. Her death was staged as if she had been robbed and killed in the streets. Her family accepts it without question, which will make progressing past this a smooth process. Thoughts of my future pierced my mind like needles being shot from every direction. I found myself wishing I could just live in ignorance, as if they wanted to cause me more pain and suffering. My eyes continued to read despite my internal protests. The termination was conducted by my co-head of security, Hunter Reeve. My eyes stared blankly at the page for a very long time, a flood of tears dripping down my face. The man just outside the door, the man I had finally started to create a friendship with, that man had killed my mother. A faint conversation began outside the room. Now scared for my own life, I used all the willpower I could muster to put the books back in the box and pretend I had seen nothing. Making my way to a different section of the library, I felt as if the whole world was shaking when the metal door swung open, inviting a heavy amount of the painfully familiar citrus scent inside. "Felix!" shouted Douglas Maverick from across the room. Suppressing a sob, I replied, "Hey, I'm researching my next hunt, just like you told me to." "That's great, Felix," said Douglas Maverick, his footsteps getting closer to the box. "Sorry for interrupting, I just forgot to do something here earlier." From the sounds of clanking and snapping, I imagined that Douglas was relocking the box's chains. Though we couldn't see each other through the rows of books, I felt as if Douglas Maverick was staring directly at me. Surely he doesn't know, I told myself, attempting to stop myself from hyperventilating. I thought, I put everything exactly back where it was. He wouldn't risk doing anything irrational if he had no evidence that I saw it. "I'll be off then, Felix," shouted Douglas Maverick from across the room. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving only a weak tint of citrus in the room around me. How am I supposed to be a treasure hunter now? I asked myself. I guess the real question is, can I even stop? I read through a particularly large book, not a single word of it catching my attention. I guess I don't have to stop. What they did was horrible, but continuing might still be worth it. Thoughts of fame and acceptance graced my mind as a few stray tears escaped my eyelids. This is what I always wanted, I told myself quite audibly. I won't allow anything to ruin this opportunity. I was eventually able to shift my attention to the books as I researched the area my next hunt would take place in. I thought of all the amazing stories that could come from an adventure in this location. The shaking in my hands and legs only returned as I exited the library later that day. Hunter's smirking yet friendly face cast towards me. Trying to smile back, I wasn't sure if my face was resembling that of a happy person or a terrified frog. "Did you find anything useful?" asked Hunter, pulling up his sleeve to inspect his silver watch. "Yeah, it's a pretty dangerous place, but that only serves to make it more of a fun hunt," I replied, thinking of how unfun the last dangerous hunt had been. Hunter nodded as I went to leave the room. Unfortunately, I was rudely interrupted. "Felix, how is your arm doing?" asked Douglas Maverick, closing the door to his office, a glowing half-peeled orange in his hand. It's fine, I replied, praying my previous tears were no longer noticeable. I can already see some improvement. That's fantastic, said Douglas Maverick. I think we're both very eager to get you back on the field. The fans desperately want to hear more of your adventures. Douglas shifted his gaze away as he said, I don't want you to worry too much about it, but the buyer for the Fruitless tree isn't particularly... Douglas paused before using extra emphasis as he said, patient. My face once again did its best impression of a smile as I nodded and left the room. Nearly falling over, I tried to decide where to go. I don't want to go back home, especially if my father manages to get certain information out of me, I thought. I frowned intensely. I'm not happy about it, but Jamie is probably the best choice. I returned to the old street where I used to live in my early childhood. From the rugged houses that lined the dirt path, many could be mistaken for larger piles of wood and stone. Clearly, there still wasn't quite enough money in Redtown just yet. If I could completely restore a neighborhood like this from my riches... I paused, imagining how great the publicity would be. I'm surprised this neighborhood even got like this in the first place. I'd expect repairing a place like this would be the first priority among treasure hunters. I gazed upon the house that I knew to be Jamie's. At least it had been back in the day. The house surprisingly didn't have any broken windows and appeared to be in quite good condition. All the stone bricks and wood boards were in place, making the house appear to be a big brown and gray cube. All the homes were meant to appear like a cube, but most were now unrecognizable. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door, hoping desperately that Jamie wouldn't ask too many questions. Realizing there was a real possibility that Jamie didn't even live in the house anymore, the door swung open so fast it seemed as if a gust of wind had passed by. Felix, said Jamie, beaming at me, did you think over the stuff from earlier? Kind of, I replied, realizing I wasn't going to get off very easily. Ushering me inside, Jamie asked, what exactly do you mean? Deciding it was best to just let it out, I told Jamie everything about my discovery so that she wouldn't be able to ask more questions. Not appearing stunned at all, Jamie said, I honestly suspected that that was the case myself. Seeing the look on my face, she hurriedly continued, not that it's not horrible or anything. I mean, it practically ruined your dream job. No, I won't let it. Now definitely appearing stunned, Jamie asked, how can you? They killed your mother to cover up the dangers they're causing for people like you. It was then I realized that telling Jamie had only made it easier for her to ask questions I didn't want to answer. As if reading my mind, Jamie changed the subject. If you want to stay the night, you can sleep on the extra mattress in the other room. She started to turn away. If you need me for something, I'll be in my room. Her pattering footsteps stopped. The one that used to be my parents'. I stood above the extra mattress lying in the corner of what used to be the living room. Jamie, her sister, and her parents used to all live in the house together. Whenever I would come over, it always seemed so alive, despite 4 people not really being that much. Now only the 2 unidentified spills on the mattress and the dirty treasure hunter action figures on a shelf behind me served to show that they were even here, I thought. I vaguely remembered Jamie's father being a big treasure hunter supporter. So many people were that it only stood out to me due to Jamie herself not being one. Clearly, that never changed. I didn't know Jamie's younger sister very well, but I did notice that she seemed to be very prominently featured in the many pictures around the house. I was left wondering exactly what had happened since our childhood, especially due to Jamie being almost completely absent from the many portraits on the walls. I never bothered Jamie, so she never left her room. Though I felt slightly bad about it, I didn't want her yelling at me like my father had. I understood that one in my situation might have given up. However, I decided that the only problem was emotional. If I just moved on from it, I could still have the career of my dreams. Forgetting the 2 miscellaneous spills on the mattress, I laid down and attempted to sleep. It took quite a while as my mind was flooded with thoughts of how great things were going to be. The memory of the event with the spiker appeared in front of me. Eventually, I will have it all to myself, I thought, shifting on the mattress slightly. All I need to do is just work a little more. Waking up early again, I left before I had to interact with Jamie. In my mind, I was doing the both of us a favor. The waiting room seemed less dull than normal. Hunter had been happy to see me, at least in his own sort of way. While sitting on a fancy chair that seemed just a little different from the rest, I thought only of the future. The past could not provide anything helpful, so there was no reason to dwell on it. Inviting me into his office, Douglas exclaimed, "Your arm appears to be doing much better than yesterday." He sat back down in his extremely comfortable looking chair. "It's only a matter of time now until you are in perfect shape to get the next piece." "Yeah, I hope so," I replied, sitting in the slightly less comfortable chair on the other side of the desk. "I'm excited to use everything I've learned about the location." "I can't wait either," said Douglas. He paused for a moment. "If you don't mind, would you tell me about the stuff you've learned?" "It's going to be a slow day for me, so I'll be a lot more interested in this kind of stuff than normal." As Douglas put his legs on the desk and leaned back in his chair, I began dumping all the interesting information I had learned. He definitely seemed more interested than I thought such a sporadic individual like himself would be, but he still wasn't all there. As I began explaining the general gist of my plan, he interrupted me. "I don't think the Spiker will be accompanying you this time," said Douglas, his smile shrinking. "Don't get me wrong, he definitely wants to, but I couldn't let him due to, other responsibilities." Cleaning his red-tinted glasses with a rag that appeared to be vibrating and making a faint buzzing noise, he continued, "I do hope that won't be any kind of problem for you." Closing my mouth, I successfully suppressed a small chuckle. I was very happy not to have to share anything with the Spiker. The hunt would be a bit more dangerous, but I thought it would be well worth it if I got all the fans to myself. For a day, everything seemed right. The lights in the building were much brighter than normal, and the breeze outside was warm rather than freezing. As the sun set, the sky showed many bright colors that were so often unheard of in nature. It was only then that the worrying returned. What if Douglas discovers that I know about my mom? I thought, trying and failing to take a deep breath. All my fame just gone in an instant. I grew very anxious considering the possibilities of my life being ruined. I worried that my fame would be lost and that there would be no one to remember my work. However, I never put any thought into whether Douglas Maverick would kill me. I figured that if my fame and legacy were stripped from me, my life would be meaningless anyway. I returned to Jamie's home, where she let me in without question. She spoke very little before returning to her room. I once again felt guilty, but I recognized that it was probably best for both of us. As I laid on the old mattress once again, I realized that Jamie had seemed exhausted. Her torso and head hung forward as she appeared to have bits of black powder stuck to her face. All this time I never considered what job she had. Clearly, it wasn't a very nice one. For the next 3 days, I went to the library and Jamie left to work. We did not interact much at all before or after we did so. Every time I saw her, she looked a little worse. She bore a few small cuts and large amounts of soot that she did not cleanse herself of. However, I was most able to dismiss this because I knew she was a strong person. If it gets too much, I'm sure she'll stop, I thought to myself whenever the subject came up in my mind. I distracted myself further by staying in the library reading about Tri-City. Eventually, I stopped researching my next hunt and just read whatever was interesting. I then understood why Ryan had been so excited about Tri-City. The thoughts of Ryan may have been enlightening, but they weren't necessarily welcome. I didn't want to think about that hunt if I didn't have to. As long as all I remembered from it was the event that came after, I was satisfied. As I read in the library, not once did I even glance toward the chained-down box. It could have been wide open for all I knew. Its contents mattered not to me. If I thought about them, it would only bring unnecessary pain. It was on the 4th day that Douglas finally said with a glint in his eye, "I think you're ready to get back to work, Felix." The lights in the waiting room flickered. "Trust me, all this work you've done will be well worth it. You have a long and fruitful career ahead of you, my friend." The hole in my arm was long gone, and it appeared that the bone had somehow reattached itself inside. I was ecstatic at the thought of returning to my treasure hunting. After experiencing the love and respect of the people of Red Town, everything else felt sort of dull. That only made me more determined to become a great treasure hunter. "I'll do it today," I said, my voice almost cracking. Douglas's lips twitched as he picked up a glowing orange. "The sooner the better," he said. Now fully smiling, he looked up at me and said, "Once this is all done, I'm sure your family will be very proud of you." "I've only got my dad left," I said, wondering if he was trying to play dumb. "Oh, I know, I merely misspoke," said Douglas Maverick, no longer smiling. "I'm sure your father would be very proud of you." Why would he admit to knowing about my mom? I wondered, slowly standing up. Maybe he wants to see if I have an over-the-top reaction. If that's the case, I won't give it to him. Good luck, Felix, said Douglas Maverick as I put my hand on the doorknob. Not that you'll need it with all the research you've done. I closed the door behind me on the now beaming Douglas. As long as I act oblivious, he won't do anything, and we can still work this out, I thought to myself. On my way out of the building, I found that the door to the Spiker's office was ajar, allowing me to view its contents. When will I get an office? I wondered, peering into the Spiker's. The light bulb on the ceiling was shattered, and the rest of the room appeared to be generally messy. The Spiker's files had been opened, and their contents poured out onto the floor. The massive mechanical arm the Spiker had used as a sort of improvised artifact weapon was draped on the wall next to a large picture leaning to the right. I could make out the Spiker with his flowing red hair looking the happiest I'd ever seen him. Even happier than he was at the fan event. He stood next to a short woman of which I did not recognize. She bore brown hair even longer than his and was also smiling wide. A couple other framed pictures were scattered around the room, most containing the same woman. These pictures appeared to be the only things in the room that could be considered to be in pristine condition. Attempting to leave the door in the same manner that I found it, I continued into the streets. With my knowledge, and some training with my dagger I'd done on the side, I was ready for the hunt. I was especially ready considering that I would be allowed to do it by myself. After having gone to find the second artifact, I returned generally unscathed, holding a very small log-shaped brown metal item. The hunt had gone exactly to plan, but I was thinking very little about it. All I wanted to do was see the fans again. Ah, you got it, said Douglas ecstatically. I hope you're ready to tell this story to all of Redtown. Bearing no wounds, Douglas sent me outside immediately. I watched for the next 10 or so minutes as a massive crowd formed around the building. It was all for me. I had earned it, myself. As I told the story and amazed all the young boys and girls, I realized that I wasn't having as much fun as I hoped. Sure, it was a good time, but it had only a fraction of the impact on me as the first event did. Each beaming smile I observed had very little meaning to me. However, it did have some meaning, even if it wasn't much. There still was a comforting warm feeling in my stomach, just to a smaller extent. The event was over before I knew it. I sat back in the waiting room, not really waiting for anything in particular. I told myself that it was the best thing I had ever experienced. The only problem was that that wasn't true. Maybe it just wasn't enough, I thought, slouching in my chair. There are plenty of people in Redtown that didn't come. I still got a lot of fame to be gained. I thought back on what I had done. Instead of feeling a sense of fondness, I just wished I could do it again. Tell the story again, see all the fans smiling at me again, maybe even do the actual hunt again. The memory of doing those things was not enough to feed the craving inside me. Jamie had not come to see me. This wasn't surprising at all, but in a strange way it hurt. I found myself imagining Jamie and my father cheering for me as I stood before a huge crowd. I imagined how far I could have been by now if they had only supported me. Hunter shifted from the other side of the room. How was it? The whole event thing, I mean. It was great, I said. A slight tinge in my stomach made me feel as if I was lying, so I continued. I just wish I had more support from a few people. I get it, Felix, said Hunter. He took a few steps forward. Some people just think they're always right. Nothing you can do about that. He uttered a little too audibly. Your mother was a great example. Excuse me? Asked, caught off guard. Hunter's eyes wide open, he took a step back. I just knew that she was a stubborn person, that's all. Sure, I said, sounding surprisingly genuine. I guess she did work here, didn't she? Yes, of course, replied Hunter, making it back to the wall he usually leaned on. It's a real shame that she couldn't keep working with us. Seemingly realizing what he had said, he quickly added, I mean, it's a shame that she died. I'm sure she would have kept working with us if it wasn't so. Hunter paused for a fraction of a second too long. Unlucky. I don't know about that, I said, praying I wouldn't get myself any deeper. I don't think she really liked the job. Hunter's eyes began to squint as he continued. It was probably just because my father hated treasure hunting so much. He always seemed to be pretty good at influencing our opinions. Hunter's eyes narrowed further as he said, If I'm not incorrect, she said she convinced her husband to let the family move. Hunter paused for a moment as his mouth opened slightly. She even claimed that she got him to make an entire cabin without any convincing. Attempting to fake a small chuckle, I saw Hunter begin to walk towards Douglas Maverick's office. "Well, I hope you can get the support you need," said Hunter, not meeting my gaze. He swiftly entered the room without knocking or looking back at me. I found myself shaking and sweating intensely. Looking at a large clock hanging above me, I decided it was late enough to leave.